Hi, my name is Rahul Drasan and I work as an AWS Solution Architect and a Udemy instructor. In this video, I'm going to show you how to build an end-to-end fictious banking application using AWS API Gateway, Lambda and S3. This video is part of my AWS CloudFormation course on Udemy, and you can check out the course from the links below in the comment section. Let's take a look at the architecture now on what we're going to build. In this lecture, I'm going to walk you through the serverless banking use case that we are going to develop in the next few lectures using the CloudFormation. So we're going to use the AWS API Gateway, AWS Lambda and S3 bucket. So in this use case, we'll have a retail user who wants to check his account balance status. So he makes an API call to the API Gateway, which will invoke the Lambda function. Once the Lambda function is invoked, it will run the code that's there in this AWS Lambda function. And then it's going to read this JSON object that we have within the S3 bucket and then return the value to the API gateway, which will be consumed by the end user. So as part of this use case, we are going to first create the S3 bucket. Then we're going to create an IAM role, Lambda execution role, which will basically allow the AWS Lambda to access the objects in S3. Then we're going to create an AWS Lambda API gateway. And then we're also going to create Lambda invoke permissions, which will allow API gateway to invoke the Lambda function. So let me show you all the services that we're going to create and end-to-end demo so that you get a clear view of what we're going to build by the end of this section. Okay, so the first thing we're going to build is going to be this S3 bucket with balance status 06230001, and then it will have a JSON object. And let me just show you what's there. And open. So you can see it has one record, name John Doe, account number, and balance status. Next, we're going to create an IAM role. So you can see the Lambda execution role. It will have access to S3 bucket. Then we're going to create a Lambda function. And then this Lambda function would have some application code. And this is going to read the object in the S3 bucket. And then finally, we're going to create the API gateway. So this is the API gateway we're going to create. So this is our REST API. Then we're going to create a resource called balance status 01, and it will have a method get. So if I just click on this get method and test it out, and you can see this is the value it's going to return. So it will return the name John Doe, account number, and balance status that we saw in this JSON object that we had here. Thank you. Okay, as discussed, now we're going to build this account balance status application using CloudFormation. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create an S3 bucket. Then we're going to create an IAM role in the next lecture. And then we're going to create an AWS Lambda in the following lecture. Then API gateway and Lambda permissions. In this lecture, we're going to start off by creating the S3 bucket. So we'll have one attribute called as bucket name. And we'll name that as balance status 0623. Now let me go to my Visual Studio Code editor. So here now I have a blank CloudFormation serverless use case .yaml file that I have created. So it's blank right now. Let me go to Google and let me search for CloudFormation anatomy, and I'll just go here. So I'm on this page. Let me go and go to YAML section, then just copy this and let me just paste it here. So for now we are only going to use the AWS template version description. And what we're going to do is we're going to use resources. So we'll get rid of everything else. Later, once we build this application, then we're going to add the parameters, metadata, and other sections. So let me just get rid of all this. Okay, so first is AWS template format version. So if I go back and click on format version, so we can just copy it from here. So I'll just paste it here. Okay, now we have to give a provider description. So I will say this is a banking app using S3, Lambda, and API Gateway. Okay, now we're going to create a set of resources. So the first thing we're going to do is create an S3 bucket. So let me go here and search for AWS CloudFormation S3 bucket. And let's go here. Okay, now these are all the attributes that are present in the S3 bucket. So if I go to my PPT, so we had decided that we're going to only use the bucket name, and I'll give you the reason why. But before that, let me go here and copy this. So you can see now this page, if I go to the YAML section, it has a lot of attributes. So it has properties such as accelerated configuration, access control, analytics, bucket encryption, bucket name, etc. And you can read a little bit about what they do from here. And we can just check if it's required, no, access control, no. So pretty much everything you see here is not required. Even the bucket name, it's no. If you don't provide a bucket name, then it will automatically generate a bucket name for this particular bucket. So you can see pretty much everything is not required. So here's some sample that it has given. So maybe I'll just copy this and I will just go here. So the first thing we have to do is we have to provide it a logical name. So we'll say banking S3 bucket and then give them space, and we just copy the sample configuration that's been provided here. So I'll go back here and paste it. I'll get rid of these resources because we already have the resources here, and it will say S3 bucket. We don't need this because we're saying banking S3 bucket, and deletion policy retains. I'll get rid of this. We don't need this. And then we have the S3 bucket, and we have the name of the bucket. So in the name of the bucket that we're going to provide, let's call it as balance status 0623. So I'll just do a save. If this looks good, I think the only change we need to make is that bucket name should not be in uppercase. So let me just modify this and let me just save. Now let me go to the CloudFormation service and I'll do create stack and upload a template, choose file, and this is the one. So let's say next. Let's call it as banking app. Okay, I forgot the G. Next, and then do next. Do a submit. Okay. Okay, it's giving me an error saying this balance status 0623 already exists. So what we need to remember is that the S3 bucket should be globally unique, not only in your account. So let me just quickly modify this and let me give it a unique name. Let's say 001. Hopefully there is no other bucket globally with this name. So let me go back and let me just delete this tag. Okay, let me go back and create stack. Template, choose file, and let's select this file. Next, let's call it as banking app 01. Next, submit. Okay, I just waited a few minutes and now it's showing this as complete. So let me go to resources. If I go here, now I can see this S3 bucket balance status 0623001. Okay, great. So in the next lecture, what we're going to do is we're going to create an IAM role with these attributes. In this lecture, we're going to create a Lambda execution role, basically an IAM role, which gives access to Lambda function to be able to retrieve data from the S3 object. So if you look at the architecture diagram here, we have the Lambda function. Now it needs access to this S3 bucket to be able to read the data in this JSON file. So we'll create an IAM role and attach it to the Lambda function. These are some of the attributes we're going to add to our IAM role, which is the role name, assume role policy document, description, and managed policy ARNs. So now let's go ahead and look at the documentation. So I will search for CloudFormation IAM role, and we can go here. So you can see the IAM role here, and if I go to the YAML section, so these are some of the properties that we have for IAM role. So you have the assumed role, policy document description, manage policy ARN. So let's take a look. Assumed policy document. So it's a required attribute. So what we need to do here is we need to define the trust policy that is associated with this role. So we'll need to define which service will be able to assume this role. Okay. Then you have the description. You can provide the description. It's not required, but we'll just provide. Then you have the managed policy ARN, and I will tell you a little bit more about this. Then you have the max session duration, which is not required, so we'll not use this. Then you have the path to this role, and this parameter is optional, so we'll just skip it. Then you have the permission boundary, again it's not required, so we'll just skip it. Policies, it's again not required. Role name, it's not required, but we'll provide a role name. And then you have the tags. So if you take a look at the sample here, so this is the sample policy. You can see some of the attributes. So the first is assume role policy documents. So we had seen that this is mandated. This is the description of the policy document. So we'll just copy the same thing. Then path, it's not required, so we'll not use this. Then you have the policies that's defined here. And there's some other attributes. But for now, what we'll do is we'll go and copy this from here. Okay, then we'll go to our template, and here we're going to say Lambda execution role, and then we'll give some space, and we'll just paste the template that we'll just copied from. So I'll just move it a little bit here. Okay. Now the things we had discussed: assume policy, that is a mandatory thing, we'll keep the description. Manage policy ARN, we'll keep it. Max session duration, as we saw, it's not required. Path is not required. Permission boundary is not required. Even the policy is not required. Role name will keep. And then tags, we'll just not keep the tags for now. Now let's go ahead and add these attributes. So if I go here, and then I can go to this reference example. So I'll just copy this reference example. So assume role policy document. So I will just copy this whole thing, and I'll just paste it here. Okay, now you can see we have the version effect allow principal. Now here the principal is going to change, because the principal, if you see here, it is EC2, but our principal is going to be Lambda function, because the Lambda function needs access to S3. So we'll just replace it with Lambda, and action is okay, STS assume role. So description, we'll say IAM role for Lambda to access S3. Okay, now manage policy ARN. So what is manage policy ARN? I'll just show you. So if I go to the console and go to IAM role, so I'm on the IAM service. So if I just go to policies, and then if I just search for S3, because we need full access to S3 for AWS Lambda, and here it is. So if you just click on this, you can see the policy ARN here. So I'll just copy this ARN, and I'll go back to my template, and then replace this by the ARN and the role name. So this will be Lambda execution role. Okay, and we'll save. That's pretty much it we require from the Lambda execution role perspective. So let me go ahead and run this. So I will go to the CloudFormation. So this is the existing stack that we had run earlier. So I'll just do an update, replace current template, upload template, choose file, and I'll just use this one. I'll do next, next, next. Okay, so we'll just wait for this Lambda execution role to get created. Okay, I just waited a few minutes, and now it's showing as update complete. So if I go to resources, and this is my S3 bucket, and this is my Lambda execution role. You can see it has been created, and the permission it has is Amazon S3 full access. Okay, that's pretty much it from this lecture. In the next lecture, what we're going to do is we're going to create a AWS Lambda function using the CloudFormation. Thank you. Now in this lecture, we're going to create an AWS Lambda function, and these are the attributes that we are going to provide for our Lambda function. So what this Lambda function would do is, if you remember the architecture, so this Lambda function, when it is triggered, it will make a call to this S3 bucket and read the data in this JSON object and pass it back to the API gateway. So in the previous lecture, we already created an IAM role that will be used by this Lambda function. Now let's see how we can create this Lambda function. So I just want to tell you that I have already written the application code in Python for this particular Lambda function, and I will have a separate lecture on what that code does. But the focus of this is more to create a Lambda function than talking about the application code. So that code I have taken from my another Udemy course on AWS Lambda, Python and Serverless. If you're interested, you can look at this course. But anyways, I will provide the application code in a separate video. Okay, now let's just search for CloudFormation Lambda function. And here it is. Now you can see it has a lot of attributes. So if I go to YAML, so it has architecture, code signing, dead letter configuration, etc. So if you see what are the mandatory fields, architecture, well, it's not. The default value is x86-64, so we'll just skip it. So code, so the code for the function you have to provide, so we'll provide that. And I already have it here. And as I said, it's part of my other Udemy course. Then code sign config, we don't need that. You can see it's required, no. Dead letter configuration not required. Description, it's not required, but we'll just provide description. Environment, and you can see other attributes which are mostly no. Okay, handler code, it's not required. Then image configuration, layers, memory size, package. So one thing is package type. There are two package types here. One is set to image and the other one is set to zip. So if you have a container image, then you have to provide image, otherwise you can set it at zip. Okay, then you have to provide the IAM role. So you can see this is required, this is mandatory. Runtime, you have to provide the runtime, and it can be either of these highlighted here. So we'll use the Python 3.9, which is the latest one. And then there are some other things like tags, timeout. So we'll also provide the timeout value. You can see the default is 3 seconds and the maximum value is 15 minutes. That's 900 seconds. Okay, so now let's go ahead and start adding these attributes. This is a sample that's been provided here. So maybe we'll just use this sample. So just remember, the only mandatory things that we require from these ones is the code and IAM role. So let me just go to my template and let's call this as Lambda function. Okay, and I'll just paste this sample that we have here. Okay, so I think we just don't need this. We just get rid of all this stuff. Okay, so I just copied that sample code that was provided here at the bottom, and it had resources, etc. So we had already provided resources. That's why I deleted. So I deleted this stuff and this stuff. So I just started from here. Okay. So now let's go ahead and modify runtime. So the runtime we had was Python 3.7, right? 3.9 rather. So I'll just select Python 3.9, which is the latest on June 2023. So I will just replace this role ARM. Now role is the one which we have created here, if you can see, and basically the Lambda execution role, and that we can take from this Lambda execution role. So I'll just copy this and I will say ref, and you can take the value from there, Lambda execution role. So handler, handler, I will just come back to handler for now. Now you have the next one, you have the code. So this is a mandatory field. Okay, so there are multiple ways of adding code to this Lambda function. So let's go back and just see. So here you can see the code attribute. If I just open it in a new tab, so you can see there are multiple ways where you can store the code. So either you can use an image URI if you are using a container, or you can store it in S3 bucket, or you can use S3 key, object variation or zip file. So if I just go to zip file, you can see here you can use for Node.js and Python. So what you do is you can just add it inline as well. So you don't need to push it to S3 bucket or some other. So you can see here you can push it to S3 bucket. But if you want to just do inline, then you can use the zip file. But the handler name would be index.handler. So that's why I have put index.handler here as a handler. Now we're going to write the code inline. We could also put it S3, but I'm just going to put it inline. Code, which is the attribute. Then you have the zip file. You can see here the zip file, which is part of the code, like Lambda function code. Okay, and then you just put the code whatever you have here. So I already have the code that I have written. So I'll just copy this and I'll just copy this whole thing and I would replace it with zip file. So I'll replace it with zip file. So this is my Lambda code. Okay, so this is moved a little this side. So I'll move a little back. So maybe I'll just move this up here. Okay, now it's not giving me an error, so everything seems good. So now we have to provide a description. So you can see there are other attributes as well. If I go back here, so you also have the description. You can see the description here. It's not a mandatory, but we'll just provide. So let me say API Gateway Lambda S3. Okay, track configuration. I don't think we need that. Okay, let's take a look at our PPT. What were the attributes we were thinking of adding? So description we have added, function name we have not added, handler we have added, role we have added, runtime we have added, timeout we can, or it's just take default. So maybe let's just add timeout as well. So let's say timeout. And let's see what's there in the timeout. So if I go to timeout, you can see the default is 3 seconds, but we don't want default, so I'll just put it maybe 60 seconds. Sometimes if you just put as default, it might not work. So this is 60. Okay, and we need the role name. So role name is again not a mandatory one, but it's just good to provide. So role name. Okay, so there is no role name, so it's a mistake on my part. It's basically a role, and that role which the Lambda function is going to use to retrieve data from S3. So basically the IAM role, and what it needs to be is the Amazon resource name. So what I have provided here is the reference. So it should be the ARN, and this is not the ARN, so this is incorrect. So let me just go back and to my IAM role. So this is the IAM role, that the documentation we had used for IAM role. So if we have to retrieve the ARN, then probably we need to use the function get attribute. So if you see here how we can get the ARN of that role, IAM role, is using this ARN attribute. Okay, so we'll have to provide function get attribute, the logical ID of IAM role, and then .arn. So let's do that. Okay, so the way to do that is we have to say get attribute and then the logical ID of our IAM role, so which is Lambda execution role, dot the attribute, which is what we saw here as ARN. So I'll just put ARN. Okay, so I think that pretty much looks good. So there's nothing else. Okay, one more thing I need to change is I need to make slight change to the code here. So here you can see the bucket name, and the bucket name that we had provided is this one, right? Balance status. So I will just change the bucket name in this code. And if you are using this code, then this is the change you also need to make, because the bucket name is going to be globally unique. So this is one, and then there's a key. So the data that is going to read, and that will be, let me just show you. And this will be the name of the attribute. So I'll just copy this balance. save. Okay, now I think we are good. So let me just go to CloudFormation. Okay, let's just go to CloudFormation. So I will just use the same stack and I'll just do an update, replace current template, upload the template, choose file, and I'll just upload the template. Okay, just do a submit and it will take a little bit of time. Let me pause the video. Okay, I waited a little bit and you can see now this update is complete. So let's take a look at the resources. So we have the S3 bucket, the IAM role, and the Lambda function has been created. Okay, so this is our Lambda function. And this is our code. So we have the balance status, account balance, and okay, so this looks good. Now what we need to do is, if I go back to CloudFormation and I will just go to this S3 bucket that we had created earlier, and I will upload this JSON file on this, which the Lambda function can read. So I'll just do an upload, add file, and I will just add this account balance, just do an upload. And if I just open this account balance, and you can see, so basically it just has the name, John Doe, account number, and balance status. So once I invoke the Lambda function, it should be able to read this data and print it out. Okay, now it's been uploaded here, you can see. Let's now just see independently whether it works with this Lambda function. So I'll just click on test. Let's call it test event and do a save, and then just do a test. Okay, it's giving me an error that runtime handler not found. So if you see, the runtime handler is usually index.py or whatever file name you have here, and then the function name, it should be index.lambda_handler. So if I go here, and I think I have made a mistake here in the handler, it should be index lambda_handler. Okay, everything looks good. The only thing I'm not sure of is that in the Lambda code, the key that we have provided is correct or not. So let's just take a quick look. And this is my object. So if I just click on this, and it will give you the key name. So the key name is AccountBalance.json. And I think what I have provided is just account balance. So I'll just modify this and I'll just do a save. Now I think everything looks good. Hopefully it should work now. So let me go to the CloudFormation service. So I'll just update the same stack. So I'll just say update, replace current template, upload template, choose file, and I'm going to choose the one which we just modified. Next, and okay, I'll do a submit. Okay, it might take a few minutes. I'll just pause the video. So the update is complete now. Let me just go to the resources, and we already have the S3 bucket, execution role, and Lambda function. So let me just open this. Okay, now let's just test it out, and let me click on test. Okay, and you can see I'm getting a response which says status code 200, name John Doe, account number, and balance status. So this is good. I think this is working fine. So next we are going to create now the API gateway, and then we just have to create the Lambda permissions. Thank you. Okay, in this lecture we're going to create the AWS API gateway. It's slightly more complicated than the other services. So as part of AWS API gateway, we're going to create a REST API. So we're going to create a resource whose name will be balance status, and then we're going to create methods, and then finally deployment. So let's start with the REST API. So I will go to my template and let's call it as banking REST API. Let's go ahead and search for REST API CloudFormation. And here it is. Okay, so the AWS API Gateway REST API creates a REST API. So let's go down, and you can see there are a lot of attributes that are here, and the API key source, so it's not required. Binary media files, you can read a little bit about what it does, but we are not going to use it, so I'll leave that. Body S3 location not required. Clone form, it's not required. Description not required. So you can see pretty much everything is not required. So let's see. I think the API name is mandatory. The name of the REST API, name required for REST API, not based on open API specification. Okay. So it says required conditional. So we'll just provide the REST API name. Copy it from here. So I'll just copy this and then the name. Okay, so we'll just propagate this side, and then so you have the name here. So just copy this name, or we can just name it as Balance Status API. Okay, so this is good. So I'll just do a save. And the next we're going to do is create the resource. Okay. So here's the resource, balance status. So let's just go to our documentation, or before that we can just give the logical ID. So we'll say banking status resource. So let me just go here, and under this, so I'll just do a search, API Gateway resource CloudFormation. Okay, and this is where it takes me. So you can see this is the API Gateway resource, creates a resource in an API. So the resource we are looking to create is balance status. Okay. So now let's take a look at the attributes. So it has parent ID, path ID, and REST API ID. So let me just first copy this. Okay, let's move this and with a little right. Okay, good. Now we have to see what is parent ID, path ID, and REST API ID. So REST API ID we already know. This is the REST API ID, so we can use the ref. So just say ref and copy this from here. Okay. Now path part and parent ID. Let's see what that means. So parent ID, the parent's resource identifier. So it's required, yes. And then you have the path part, the last path part segment of this resource. So let's take a look at some sample, what it has provided. So here REST API is my ref API. Okay. Parent ID is get attribute my API, that is the name of our REST API, and the root resource ID. So if I go back to the REST API, you can see this is the REST API we created, REST API. And if you go down, you can see here function get attribute root resource ID. So this is how you will get the root resource ID. Okay, so let me just go back, and in the parent ID, so I'll just say get attribute, and then what is the name of my logical ID of my REST API. So let's say dot, and then if I just go back and copy this the root resource ID. So this is how I can create the parent ID. And path part is basically what is the name of your resource. So we'll say balance status, maybe we'll say balance status 01. So we'll just mark it as balance status 01. So if I can just go to the console, so I've gone to the API service, and this is one of my pre-existing APIs that I've created. So here you can see this balance status. This is basically the resource that will get created, and this is the resource ID. Okay, that's pretty much it from the banking status resource perspective. So I'll just do a save. Next, we're going to create a method get, but method get and the deployment we're going to create in the next video. But before that, we can just check out if REST API and resources are getting created. So I'll just do a save and go to my CloudFormation service, and I'll just update the existing stack that we have. So I'll just say update, replace current template, Forward template. So it's complaining of circular dependency. Let's just take a look. So it's saying that REST API ID. Okay, so this is a mistake I made here. So I've just given the logical ID of this resource itself. So rather it should be that of the REST API. So I'll just change this and I'll just do a save. Let's try and re-upload. So I'll just update. Next, okay, next. So it's updating, so I'll just wait for a few seconds. You can see it's created the banking REST API. Now it's creating the resource bank status. Okay, resource is also complete. So if I go to this REST API, and you can see bank balance status 01 is already created. Now we have to create a method. Right now it does not have any method and neither have we deployed it. So in the next lecture, we're going to create the deployment as well as the method. Thank you. Okay, now let's go and create the method. So it's slightly tricky and I will show you why. So first of all, let's go to our template and say banking status method. Okay, and I'm going to go here and search for this one. So I just API Gateway method CloudFormation. So I'll just search for this and I'll just open this. So now I'm on the API Gateway method. So you can see it has a lot of attributes, and if you can just go through, so you have the API required, no, it's not required, authorization scopes, authorization types, and we're going to all skip all these. So HTTP method integration. If you know about the API gateway, there are multiple backend integration methods. So you can have an HTTP endpoint, HTTP proxy, AWS. So it integrates with a lot of AWS services, and in this case, we are using the Lambda, which is again for which we will have to use AWS, then AWS proxy. So what AWS proxy does is it does not do any transformation. It's straight away whatever is backend, it will send the data as it is. But we want some transformation, so we'll use AWS. Then you also have mock integration for testing purpose. Okay, so then there are some other things and you can go through. We're not going to use most of them. Now let's take a look at a sample example. So here is a sample example that has been provided. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this one. So remember that it's in this type, the type is AWS proxy, which means it's not going to do transformation. So we're going to use a little more complex one where we have the Lambda function and it's not a proxy. So I will just copy this template and let me go here and I will just paste it. This looks okay. So this example also has the resource part, you can see here. And so I'm just going to get rid of this because we already have created the resource here. Okay. And then it gives the name proxy resource, but we don't need that. Okay, I'll get rid of this. Okay, I will just move all this stuff with a little right. So one thing important is that you should learn from the examples on how you can create these resources. Okay, so that's what I'm showing you here. So the first thing is REST API ID. So this is our REST API ID. So it is a ref and our logical ID for our REST API. So this is our logical ID, banking REST API. So that's what I have replaced it with here. Then you have the resource ID. So this is our resource. And again, we're going to use the ref. So I'll just copy this. And I'm going to get rid of what he has here. And I'll just replace it with the logical ID of our resource, okay, which is this. Okay, HTTP method. So the method we're going to use is get method. We're going to retrieve data from S3 bucket. So we're going to use a get. So authorization type. So let's see what is authorization type. We go up, authorization type. So we'll mark auth. So we're not using any authorization type. There are multiple authorization base in AWS using Cognito, user pools, Lambda, authorizer, but it's not required. So I will just say none. Okay. So we can skip it, but sometimes when I was trying it out, it gives an error. So it's better to mark it as none and leave it there, though it's not shown as mandatory attribute, but still let's leave it there. Then we have the integration. So he's using integration AWS proxy. So let's see, we are not going to use proxy, which is going to use AWS. So let me go to integration. So you can see here, integration as we discussed is HTTP, HTTP proxy, AWS proxy, etc. So let's just go here and see what all are here. And these are all the attributes. Let's see. So you have the cache parameters not required, cache names, connection ID not required, connection type, either internet or you can use VPC link. If you want to route it privately, then you can use VPC link. So we'll go through internet. So we can just leave it as default. The default value is internet. Content handling, we can skip. Credentials, integration method. Okay. So in integration method, we have to provide, and if it is mock, like it was just testing, but we are not testing, so we'll have to use the post method. Okay. What AWS documentation says is that if you're using the type backend type as AWS, like Lambda function, then you have to write the integration HTTP method as post. Okay, so I think it's already here. So now we have to add the type. So let's go and see where is the type. You can see rest of them are all no, required no. So type we said we are not going to use proxy, but we are going to use AWS Lambda, and value will be for that will be AWS. So just say AWS. Now what we have to do is we have to provide the URI of our Lambda function that we had created here in this document here through this Lambda function. Okay, so let's go ahead, and this is the particular format that it needs to be written in. So here you can replace the region with, say, my region is US East 1. Okay, and Lambda path. So this is all okay. Then you have to provide this Lambda for simple proxy.arn. Okay, let me just do a save and I'll tell you what it means. Okay, now for this one, what we have to replace it is basically this is the name logical ID of your Lambda function. So I will just check what is the logical ID of a Lambda function. If you go up, and this is the logical ID, so Lambda function. So I'll just go down and replace this logical ID that he had with the one we have. And okay, so this looks good. Okay, so we have modified most of the things we require here. Okay, so we have pretty much everything that I shown in that example. But when I was trying it out, there were a couple of issues that it highlighted for which we need to add some more attributes. And that's mainly looking at the response, integration response and method response. So those two things we have to add. So within the integration, we have to add an integration response and say, okay, the response will be 200 code. So let's say integration response. Where is the integration? Okay, here is the integration, specifies the integration response. So though it says required no, but it doesn't work due to some reason. So let's say integration response, and if I go here, integration response. So type list of integration responses. So if I go here, so it's basically a list. And if you see here, so one of them is the status code. So that's what we're going to provide as a list. So status, okay, as status code. So it's one word, code, and the value would be, let's say, 200. Okay. Similarly, we have to get a method response as well somewhere here. So let's go ahead and let's look at this one. So let's look at method response. Here is the method response. So type of, it's again a list method response, you can see here, and it should have status code. So you can see here again status code. Okay, so I will go here and I will just copy this method response and add it here. So it is method response and I'll just copy this. Okay, just remember one thing, that the integration response type, integration method, they are part of the integration attribute. So that's why there's a space here. Okay, I think that's pretty much it from the method perspective. The next thing we have to add here is the deployment. So for deployment, we'll need to deploy the API. So every time you make changes to the API, you have to deploy the API. So let's create the deployment. So I will just say here API deployment is my logical ID, and let's do a search. Deployment. Okay, so here are the attributes. So you have the deployment canary settings, description, again not required, not required. REST API ID, yeah, so you have to provide the REST API ID, then you have to provide the stage description, conditional, and the stage name, so it's not required. So I will just copy, maybe I'll just copy a sample one. So let's just do that, and I'll just paste it, and now we can modify it. So get rid of this because this is logical ID. Okay, so REST API ID, that is the name of my REST API. So this is this banking REST API. So I'll modify this one here. Then the description, my deployment, to say prod, stage name, so I'll just say stage name as prod. Let's take a look at our PPT if there's anything else we want to add. So we have the description, stage name, REST API ID. Okay, so this is good. So one last thing we need to add is the depends on attribute. So what AWS recommends is that the deployment should depend on the method logical name. So a lot of times what can happen is that it gets deployed before the method is created. In that case, the CloudFormation stack is going to fail. So what we're going to do is we're going to add this depends on attribute. So let's do that. So below here, so I'll say depends on. Okay, now on the depends on, we will add what this particular service depends on, and that is on the method. So we'll provide the logical ID of method. So I'll just copy it from here. And okay, see. And that's pretty much it. We can also sometimes use depends on if required when we are creating this Lambda function. You can see that it depends on the IAM role. So sometimes, most of the time, it will create the role first and then the Lambda function. But there's also a possibility that that Lambda function might be created first. And in that case, it will give you an error because first you have to create the Lambda execution role and then the Lambda function. So maybe I'll just put it here. In our case, it's worked fine, but I just feel better to put the dependency, and it will depend on this Lambda execution role. So now what AWS will make sure is first it creates this IAM role and then creates the Lambda function. Okay, so everything looks good. The only change, sometimes it gives an issue. Let me just move to. Okay, now everything looks good. So what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to create the entire stack from scratch. So I've deleted the previous stack. So let me go to CloudFormation, create stack, and upload template, choose file. So it's going to recreate the entire stack, and let's call it as banking app 006. So I'm just giving a random name, and let's say submit. And it's going to take a few minutes. I'm just going to pause the video for a little bit. So you can see it's created a few resources: execution role, Lambda status, that's our resource, bucket, REST API. So I waited a few minutes and pretty much everything has got created. So the Lambda function, execution role, the resource, method, bucket, and REST API. So if I just go to REST API, you can see here we have the get method, we have the resource balance status, and if I go to stages, we should have prod stage. Okay, now if I go and click on the get and test it out, most probably it's not going to work. Yeah, so it's showing internal server error, and the reason for that is because we have not provided the API gateway permission to invoke the Lambda function. So that's the last thing we have to do, and in the next video we're going to do that and then test out this use case end to end. Okay, so now let's write here Lambda invoke permission, and now let's go and search for this. So let's say Lambda permission CloudFormation. Okay, so you can see here grants resource and AWS service or another account permission to use this function. So in our case, API gateway will have the permission to invoke this Lambda function. So you have the type permission, you have the properties, and these are all the properties. So you have the action, here you define the principal. So in our case, the principal would be API gateway. So that's required. Then you have the event source, it's not required, function name, the name of the Lambda function. Okay, and you can provide function name, function ARN, partial ARN, and there are some other attributes, principal. Okay, so I'll copy the sample code and then we'll just modify this one. Okay, maybe I'll just copy this one. Okay, so I'll just go here and so I'll remove this logical name that they have because we already have a logical name, and let's move this a little right. Okay, now in the properties, the first thing is the function name. So that is, in our case, it's the Lambda function. So we'll go ahead and copy that Lambda function logical ID. Okay, so our Lambda function name was, logical ID was Lambda function. Okay, so this is the one. So I just go all the way down and I will just replace it with ref. Okay, now this is good. Action, basically action is, if you go here and just go to action, it is what kind of action will be taken. So the action of the principal, in our case, the principal is the API gateway. So it will invoke. So you have either Lambda invoke function or Lambda get function. So in our case, it is going to be invoke. So this is okay. And now the principal, in our case, the principal is the API gateway. So we have to replace it with API gateway. So here, instead of the S3, because if you look at the sample example, it says invocation of S3 notification. So I'll replace it with API gateway. Okay, now the source account, and it says the ref source account. So I can also just hard code the value. So if I go to my AWS account, and here is the account number. This is my account number, so I'll just copy this. And you can also do a ref, but I'll just hard code the value. And if you're trying it out, then you just provide your account ID. Then you have the source ARN. Okay, I don't think we need the source ARN, so I'll just get rid of this. And I think this is pretty much it, what we need. So I will just update our CloudFormation stack. And let's do an update. So this should pretty much everything we need. So I'll just go here. So we'll just wait a little bit. So now remember that we have created a new stack. So our S3 bucket would not have that JSON object, that would have been deleted. So I will just go here and upload that JSON object onto this S3 bucket. So you can see it's blank. So I'll just do upload, add file, and this is our account balance. Upload, okay, close. Okay, now let's see. Okay, so it seems create complete. Its update is complete, so it's created all the resources. And the last thing we were trying to do is Lambda invoke permission. So you can see it's complete. So now we can just take a look at the demo. Okay, now that we have created the entire stack, now we should be able to test it out. So you can see here we have the banking REST API. So if I just click on this, now this is the resource that I have created, balance status 01, and this is the get method. Now if I just click on get method, the get method should be able to retrieve the data in the S3 bucket using this particular Lambda function that we have created as part of the stack. So I'll just say test, and if I do test, and you can see I got a response status 200, and this is the data I'm getting. So John Doe account number and balance status. Okay, now the next thing I can do is I can go to the stages, and this is my stage, which is prod. If I just click on this and then I take this get, so I will get this invoke URL. So I can just copy this invoke URL, and this API is now deployed to my prod stage, and just click and I should get the same data. So you can see I'm getting the same data, which is status code 200, name, John Doe, account number, etc. So this is how you should be able to create an end-to-end application using CloudFormation. Thank you very much. In the last few lectures, we created the template using the resource section, but ideally we should be parameterizing all the values that a user can input. So you don't need to hard code the values such as S3 bucket, name of the IAM role, runtime for Lambda, etc. So in this section, what we're going to do is we're going to parameterize as many values as we can. So let's go ahead and search for the parameter section. So we have parameters CloudFormation. So I'll just do a search, and let's go here. Okay, so we are on the parameter section, and we'll just pick a sample. So you have the parameters here, and below you can see some of the values that you can have for the type. So you can be either a number, integer, etc. And then the parameter values, allowed patterns, allowed values for this parameter property, and there are a lot of them. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy one sample from here, and then this is what we are going to use to modify. So it has the parameter, then it has the logical name, and then the type, whether it's string or number, what is the default value, and what are the allowed values and description. Okay, so we'll go here, and then we'll just push this resource section on down, and then we're going to type parameters here. Okay, now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to modify this banking S3 bucket. So the bucket name we're going to parameterize. So let's call it as bucket name parameter, and type again is going to be string, but bucket name is going to be a string, and then default value, we don't want to provide default value because it has to be globally unique. So I'm going to just remove everything, and then it will come as a free-form text for the user. So let's just say description, enter the name of S3 bucket, and then we're going to reference it in the resource section. So we can copy this logical ID and then just say here ref and enter the value. Now next we're going to modify the Lambda execution role. So I will just copy this whole thing, and then so I'll say Lambda name parameter, Lambda role name parameter, and again string, and we just want it to be unique. So enter the name of the Lambda IAM role. Okay, then we're just going to reference that in the role name. So Lambda execution role, and role name is here. So we're going to say ref and provide the value. Next, we have the Lambda function. So here we can parameterize maybe runtime, and the second thing we can parameterize is maybe timeout. But we'll just parameterize one just for the ease. So maybe we'll parameterize the runtime. Okay. So I will just go here and just copy this. Now just go back, So I don't need this thing. I'll just get rid of this parameters we already have, and this will be lambda runtime parameter, and the values, let's just check the values. So it's Python 3.9. So I'll just go up here, and it's again going to be a string. So Python 3.9, and here I will say allowed values. So it will come as a drop down. So we'll have Python 3.8, 9, and 7. And I'll just change to 8, 7. Enter the lambda runtime. And I'm just going to copy this and reference it in the resource section. So lambda runtime. So let's just say ref, and here's that value. Okay, so this is good. Now we can parameterize some API values for some API. So first thing is we're going to do is for the REST API. So let's say again we want the name to be unique. So I'm just going to copy this and just have it here. So let's just say REST API name, and type is string, and enter the name of REST API. Okay, REST. Okay, I think it's just API name, and I'm just going to copy this parameter and just go down and reference it in the resource. So I'll just change it here. The ref, and okay, I think I just missed, and I'll just paste it here. Okay, and then maybe we can parameterize the API deployment stage name. So let's do that, and we can just copy this. And let's call it as API stage, and type again string, default value say dev, and we can have allowed values as dev, and then QA, and then finally we have the product. Okay, and description, enter the value of API stage. Okay, so this looks good. I'll just copy this and I'll just do a ref here. Let's say ref. Okay, and I'll just do a save. Okay, so what you can see here is there are a lot of other things. Then you can parameterize maybe the HTTP method, whether you want get, post, etc. Then there are a lot of other things you can parameterize as well. But the way you parameterize is very similar to what I've shown. So I'll just stop at this, and now let me just run this and see if it works. So I'll go to stack, create stack, and upload stack, choose file. Stack with params 009. Okay, just giving some random name, API stage, maybe we'll have dev, enter the bucket name. So one thing you need to be careful is that you need to provide the bucket name that's hard coded here. We can also pass it as a parameter from the user, but for now I've just hard coded this value. So you need to use the same bucket name you have used in application code. Lambda role name parameter. So role name demo lambda 09. Okay, I'm just giving some random name. The lambda runtime, okay, is 9, and REST API demo REST API 09. Okay, now let's just go ahead and run and see if it works. Okay, I'll just pause the video for a little bit. Okay, I just waited a few minutes and the whole stack is almost complete now. So if I just go to resources, and I can see the S3 bucket. So let's just open the S3 bucket, and we'll also open the REST API and test it out. So this is my S3 bucket. Maybe I'll just upload the JSON file that I have, and here I go, upload, okay, close, and then this is my REST API. Let's see if this works. Test. Okay, great, awesome. So you can see now it's working. It has the name John Doe, account number, and balance status. Okay,